It is the year 1770. 13,000 miles away, George III is on the throne of England. On the furthest rim of the Pacific Ocean, where no European has ever been, these men struggle ashore. Their ship was sinking, holed on the coral of the Great Barrier Reef. The locals are watching them. This tropic ritual happens every year. It marks the anniversary of the arrival of the Endeavour and her captain, James Cook, on the far north coast of Queensland. Cook was the greatest navigator in the history of seafaring, and he and his passenger, the botanist Joseph Banks, now have their monuments all along the coast they discovered and charted for the first time, the east coast of Australia.
The men who were shot into space in the 1960s met nobody and brought back nothing in the way of art or literature. But by contrast, the men who sailed off into the Pacific 200 years before did a lot of writing, a lot of drawing, and a staggering amount of collecting. Not having cameras to passively record what they saw, they had to look and scribble and remember. And what they brought back changed the opinion of all cultivated Europeans about both culture and nature. There was no exploration which had greater consequences of this kind than James Cook's first voyage around the world and through the Pacific between 1768 and 1771. He took with him a team of artists and scientists headed by a young English virtuoso called Joseph Banks. The climax of their efforts, the final scientific and artistic fruit of their voyage, had big deadline problems. It is only coming off the presses now, about 200 years late. This is one image from Banks's Florilegium. The word comes from the Latin flora, meaning flowers, and legare, to bind or gather or collect. So a collection of plants made by Banks and his Swedish companion, Dr. Daniel Solander, during their voyage into the unimagined Pacific late in the 18th century. Banks spent a fortune having the plates engraved. It was going to be the most ambitious, descriptive botanical work of the 18th century, and it was not printed. Later, a few of them were printed in black and white, but now, for the first time, the complete edition is being printed in color from the original copper plates. And as far as I know, this is the largest direct printing project ever carried out in the fine arts. So we follow its begetters from landfall to landfall around the world, looking at what they saw and at what they brought back.
The 18th century world was both smaller and larger than ours. It was smaller because very few people traveled. On the other hand, it was larger because so little of it was known. Yet the tight, brawling, teeming, patronage-controlled society of Georgian England was reaching out to dominate that world. England was looking for an empire of trade, and that meant appropriating the unknown before France did. Her instruments were ships and the explorers who sailed them, and scientists too, like Joseph Banks. Banks was one of those men who give colour to an age. He helps define the very idea of the gentleman amateur, a rich scientist in a time that gave few chances to poor ones. He was born to wealthy land-owning parents in Lincolnshire in 1743. At 9, he went to Harrow. At 13, to the most famous of English schools, Eton. In the 18th century, this was the hothouse of the group to which Banks was heading, the English establishment. Here, his interest in botany began. bored by Greek and Latin and the inevitable games, he was mesmerized by plants. Banks's hobby became a passion. Like many of the best minds of Georgian England, gentlemen amateurs all, he was essentially self-taught. He had to be. When he went up to Christ Church College in 1760, he found that botany was not taught. In fact, the whole of Oxford then was an academic shambles. The idea of studying species for their own sake was very new because botany had scarcely emerged from its primitive role as an adjunct to medicine. So he hired a private tutor from Cambridge at his own expense. He could afford to. Banks's father died in 1761 and left him in sole possession of the family estates, and now he was free to do as he pleased. His widowed mother went to London to live at Chelsea, then a quiet elbow of the Thames. Her house was near the second oldest botanical gardens in England, after Oxford's, the Chelsea Physic Garden, laid out for the study of plants and herbs. The young man often visited these gardens. He now had a hero, a model, the great Swedish naturalist Linnaeus, whose colossal study of species, published in 1753, had created a whole system of naming plants. Banks also walked in the formal gardens of Christopher Wren's Royal Hospital. If Linnaeus and his disciples had named and categorized the plants of Europe, where could he, an ambitious young botanist, go? Rich Englishmen were supposed to take the grand tour to Paris and Rome. In Banks' view, that was a trip for blockheads. My grand tour, he announced, shall be around the world. But for that he needed a ship and a captain to sail her. That man was James Cook, and he was not a bit like Banks, not in birth, nor in temperament, nor in knowledge. He was 40, an expert sailor, navigator and map maker, but he was not yet ranked as captain. Banks, who was only 25 but had the pink perfect confidence of his breeding, lobbied the Royal Society to include him on Cook's proposed astronomical expedition to the Pacific to observe the transit of Venus across the face of the sun. After that, Cook would search for the great southern continent, a geographical phantom that had haunted map makers for centuries, never found, never disproved. The Admiralty agreed that Banks should go, and he enlisted a quiet, methodical Swede named Daniel Solander as his colleague on the voyage. Solander was one of Linnaeus's favorite pupils, a man imbued with a sort of missionary zeal for naming every plant in the world.
The Admiralty bought Cook a ship. She cost £2,800. She was less than 4 years old and known technically as a cat-built bark. She'd been designed for carrying coal out of the harbour of Whitby, which meant that she was shallow in draught and broad in the beam, so she could go over shoal water and easily get off sandbanks if she went aground. Hence, she was an ideal boat for navigating and exploring in unknown seas. She had a square stern and bows like buttocks. She was extremely slow and about as much like a British frigate as a barrel is like a bird. Her name was the Earl of Pembroke, but they christened her the Endeavour. Ruminating upon the conditions of shipboard life in the late 18th century, Dr. Samuel Johnson remarked, "Sir, going to sea is much like going to jail, but with the added prospect of drowning." And one can see what he meant if you think about how large the Endeavour was, or rather how small. 105 feet from stem to stern, 29 feet broad, and into this space, no longer than 8 Volkswagens put nose to tail, Captain Cook had to fit a complement of 85 ship's officers, crews, seamen and marines, along with Mr. Green, the astronomer, Messrs. Banks and Solander, the naturalists, their secretary, 4 servants, 2 artists, and a variety of animals, 2 dogs, a number of chickens, which drowned in the Bay of Biscay, not many days out of Plymouth, and 1 goat. The goat was the most seasoned sort of all. It had been round the Pacific once already, with Captain Wallace on the Dolphin.
James Cook received the savants and servants on board, and the Endeavour was made ready to sail from Plymouth in August 1768. A friend of Solander's noted that no people ever went to sea better fitted out for the purpose of natural history, or more elegantly. This would be a voyage on which botanists could make their name in an age whose chief intellectual obsession was the nature of nature. Alexander Buchan and Sydney Parkinson were to play a vital role, recording everything that was seen or discovered. The main botanical work would fall on Parkinson, a prim lad of 25, the son of a Quaker brewer in Edinburgh. Very serious, very skilled. But at first he had very little to draw. As the Endeavour buttered her way past Drake's Island and out of Plymouth Sound, he prepared to make watercolours of fish whilst they headed south towards Madeira. Three weeks out of Plymouth, their sea legs newly found, they came to Funchal and anchored under the towers of its cathedral. There was a portent of loss of life to come. The quartermaster, Alexander Weir, was caught in the anchor chain. He drowned. Cook busied himself with provisions and stores for the journey ahead. In the meantime, Banks visited the vineyards, observed the Portuguese in their colonial dress, toured the churches, and went botanizing. He found it a pleasant and productive time.
In general, we got up in the morning, went out on our researches, returned to dine, and went out again in the evening.
Now Parkinson got down to work in the great cabin of the Endeavour, drawing the plants while Banks and Solander pointed out their features and classified them. It was autumn, not the best time for collecting plants. Nevertheless, Madeira would supply the first section of the Florilegium, 11 plates in all. The Florilegium consists of 738 plates in an edition of 110 copies. It's taking nearly 10 years to finish. It's a joint venture between a private company, Alecto Historical Editions in London, and the British Museum Natural History, who own Parkinson's drawings from the Endeavour as well as the Banks copper plates.
It's on the underneath too, these.
It needs close cross-checking between the partners to ensure accuracy. Here in the museum, the master printer, Edward Egerton Williams, discusses with one of his staff the problems of turning a Parkinson painting into a Florilegium print.
Otherwise it's going to stick out like a sore thumb.
Joe Studham is managing director of Alecto. His idea set the project going in the late 1970s.
How did you come across Banks's original plates?
Well, by happy chance, really. We knew they were there ages ago, in 1963, when we first started my company. And William Stern at the museum had taken some of the plates down to the Royal College of Art to have some proofs taken in the printmaking department. And we saw them and got extremely excited, thought how wonderful it would have been to print them, and quite rightly got shown the door. And it wasn't until many years later, 1978, that we were in the British Museum of Natural History looking for something quite different, in fact. And one of the curators there, Chris Humphreys, drew our attention to the Banks plates. And there they still were, sitting in their cupboard outside the Botany Library, still wrapped up in their 18th century paper, 738 of them. And we thought what a wonderful opportunity it would be to finally complete Banks's great project of the 18th century.
They had little enough time in Madeira. In less than a week they were at sea again, running southwest towards Rio. They passed the equator, where to Banks's disgust his books and clothes were covered in mould and his razors rusted. But then the freshening winds took the Endeavour into Rio harbour by mid-November. Here, every kind of frustration awaited them. The Portuguese governor of Rio, unlike his colleague in Madeira, flatly refused to allow the Englishmen to come ashore. Day after day, they were cooped up in the ship off the island of Cobras, tantalizingly close to the city, while tempers rose and letters went to and fro. Cook made daily visits to the governor's palace under an armed Portuguese guard, vainly trying to persuade the governor to change his mind. No use. The local viceroy thought the scientists were spies. There was no way past this colonial bureaucracy, so Banks conducted his tour of the city by observing it as best he could from the deck. Before long, this distant view palled, and the plants were beckoning, so he managed to smuggle himself ashore and got a whole day collecting specimens, most of them, he said,
such as have not been described by our naturalists, as so few of them have had an opportunity of coming here. Indeed, no one even tolerably curious has been here since about the year 1640. So it's easy to guess the state in which the natural history of such a country must be.
After 3 maddening weeks in Rio, Cook got his stores on board, and Banks was not sorry to be going.
We've got all we want from these illiterate, impolite gentry, so we got up anchor and sailed.
Rio would provide 23 plates for the Florilegium. The Florilegium is printed in the Egerton Williams studio in the East End of London. Here, a staff of 20 is responsible for making the 81,180 prints in 3,740 boxes that make up the whole edition. The techniques are as close as possible to those of Banks's own time. You couldn't just unwrap the plates and print from them. They were pitted from acid in the old wrapping paper. They had to be polished and resurfaced, a finicky, meticulous business. Joe Studham.
Well, the engravers in the 18th century didn't always clean out the ink from the plate when they'd taken their proofs. No doubt they expected them to be printed fairly soon. And believe me, after 200 years, linseed oil and pigment, which is what you make engraving ink from, just goes like stone. And we've had a lot of trouble getting the right solution to loosen the muck in the lines and then brush it out. because unless you get every single line absolutely clean, you don't get a fine impression.
Now, Cook shaped his course southward towards Cape Horn. After 6 weeks running south, they reached anchorage at Tierra del Fuego in the Bay of Good Success. Solander and Banks were the first naturalists to go there, and they would be the last for 60 years, until 1832, when Charles Darwin arrived on the Beagle. It was an ill-named place, raw and miserable, and the Fuegans seemed a poor lot, straight out of Thomas Hobbes, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Banks and Solander went botanizing on the tundra. The expedition turned from a jaunt into a disaster. First, the artist Buchan had an epileptic fit. Then it started to snow. Banks's 2 black servants then drank a whole bottle of rum to stay warm, and the combination of alcohol and intense cold killed them both. The rest of the party spent a miserable night with nothing to eat except a vulture, which Banks plucked, cooked, and shared out in 10 stringy but equal portions. The next day they got back to the ship, leaving behind the dead blacks, but not the collection of alpine plant specimens that Banks had gathered. In spite of this tragedy, Tierra del Fuego would provide 65 plates for the Florilegium.
What we do is we go down to the Natural History Museum and look at the watercolors and identify all of the colors we want to put in the engraving. And there's a wonderful color chart produced by the Royal Horticultural Society, which has literally every sort of nuance of botanical color. And we identify the colors against that chart and then check it with the botanical editor. And then the printers come back to the studio and mix up a little bit of each color. And there may be 10, 12, 15, 16 colors in each engraving.
Then the printer inks each area of the plate, each leaf, each frond, each petal.
Yes, it's a process called à la poupée, which is really just a fancy way of saying multicolored single plate printing. And it's called à la poupée because what you do is you mix all the different colors, and then you get a little twisted bit of cloth, a bit of tarlatan, a little dolly, a little poupée, and you use your twist of cloth to get ink on the tip and then dab the right color into the various areas of the plate. So really what you're doing is painting by numbers. You're filling all of the lines, the engraved lines on the copper plate with the right colored ink and wiping it away where you want it to print white.
By the beginning of February, Cook had made his westing past Cape Horn, and the Endeavour stood out into the Pacific, heading for Tahiti. The winds blew mild. The Pacific, for once, lived up to its name. After 2.5 months as a speck on this blue immensity, the Endeavour sighted Tahiti on April 11, 1769. They anchored here in Matavai Bay and went ashore.
The scene we saw was the truest picture of an Arcadia, of which we were going to be kings, that the imagination can form.
Their Arcadia today is marked by a lighthouse on the point and a crude monument to Tahiti's first European visitors, Captain Wallis in 1767, Bougainville in 1768, and in 1769, James Cook.
They built a prefabricated fort on the point here, and they called it Fort Venus. Soon it became apparent that even Arcadia had its limits. Food didn't simply drop into your hand, it had to be bargained for, and that even included coconuts because the English did not know how to climb palm trees. The Tahitians were expert thieves, and what they liked best was the stuff that was most foreign to their own culture, namely metal. The Tahitian girls only charged 1 nail a night, but Captain Wallis had found a couple of years before on the Dolphin that his ship was literally coming apart at the seams because the sailors were pulling out so many spikes. The Tahitians stole every metal object they could lay their hands on, up to and including the great brass astronomical quadrant, which would have been a disaster for the expedition because without the quadrant there could be no observation of the transit. Banks very intrepidly led a search party 7 miles back into the hills to get the thing back. And he did recover it, although it was in several pieces.
They now had almost 2 months to prepare for the observation of Venus in the sky, and they would spend most of them studying her on Earth. From the moment of its discovery by Wallis, Tahiti had been both a geographical fact and a moral fiction. For enlightened Europeans of the 1760s who had read their Rousseau, it seemed to confirm the natural moral goodness of man. It was the abode of that phantom of the 18th century imagination, the noble savage. Uncorrupted, living in harmony with nature and his gods, the living proof that Homo sapiens, if left to his own devices, was good. Here, the air was sweet, bodies were perfect and freely given. There were no shortages to cause competition and therefore crime. It seemed so natural to imagine these people as classical survivors of some mythical golden age, as ancient Greeks in a Pacific time capsule, that Banks gave Greek nicknames to the first Tahitians that he got to know. The men were nobly athletic, the women beautiful and full of curiosity about the European strangers. The island presented endless opportunities for what Banks called gallantry, a pastime made even more enjoyable by the fact that the Tahitians constantly bathed themselves, unlike the dockside prostitutes who made up the sexual horizon of most of the Endeavour's crew. The only thing that put Banks off, and that not much, was their habit of anointing themselves with coconut oil like sunbathers today. It was disagreeable, or...
At first we found it so, but very little use reconciled me at least completely to it. These people are free from all smells of mortality, and surely rancid as their oil is, it must be preferred to the odoriferous perfume of toe and armpit so prevalent in Europe.
Banks saw Tahiti as an economic paradise as well.
Scarcely can it be said that they earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, when their chiefest sustenance, breadfruit, is procured with no more trouble than that of climbing a tree and pulling it down.
Banks's opinions on breadfruit as food for natives would be noticed in the West Indies, whose sugar growers wanted cheap food for slaves. In due course, the bounty would be sent to Tahiti for a load of seedlings. But in the meantime, Banks and Solander were having happy days on Tahiti, collecting and sorting its plants, while Sydney Parkinson assiduously drew them. The only shadow was cast by Alexander Buchan, who had another epileptic fit and died. Banks mourned the inconvenience more than the man.
His loss to me is irretrievable. My airy dreams of entertaining my friends in England with the scenes that I'm to see here are vanished.
So it was Parkinson who had to do his best to record the Tahitian costumes, their ceremonies, their dances, their way of life, along with their plants. The Society Islands, as they were named, would eventually provide 89 plates for the Florilegium.
There is no question of cancelling the plates, as with the normal etching edition at the end of the run, is there?
No, not at all. I mean, what we've been trying to do is to bring the plates absolutely back to their pristine condition. In fact, the British Museum have undertaken unequivocally not to allow any other printing from the plates for 50 years. I mean, nobody would be so mad as to embark on printing 738 of these plates in colour. And in a way, there's no point. Now they've been done, now they've been changed from their tarnished copper into nice colour prints.
Getting the colours and the impression right takes up to 2 months per plate. For every impression, this has to be done again. Ink, print, clean, and re-ink. There was also the matter of the transit. To the disappointment of the astronomer who had come so far on the endeavour, Mr. Green, the results of the observation were fuzzy. So his long voyage had been more or less in vain. This didn't worry Banks or Solander. Their work was going marvellously well.
But all good things come to an end. They'd been in Tahiti for 3 months. The observations were done, the island was charted, the great cabin of the Endeavour was bulging with Banks's botanical specimens, and the machinery of Arcadian myth, which was going to produce such wonders as Paul Gauguin and the Club Med, was now wound up and ticking. They dismantled the fort on Point Venus, and reluctantly the sailors, the officers and the gentlemen filed on board the Endeavour, nursing their memories and, in some cases, their gonorrhea. 2 of the Marines deserted with their women, but they were caught and dragged back. It was time to go.
They took with them a volunteer, a Tahitian named Tupaya, who hoped to see England. Banks saw him as an exotic pet. Meanwhile, James Cook opened the Admiralty's secret instructions for the second part of the voyage. He was to drop down south of Tahiti, below the equator, right down to 40 degrees south latitude. And then he was to run west until he found the coast of the fabled southern continent. Or until he did not find it, for Cook's task was to resolve the issue once and for all by eliminating it. After nearly 3 months in the open sea, they raised land on the 8th of October, 1769. It was the east coast of New Zealand. Their landfall was the site of Gisborne on the North Island, which has a few monuments of a sort to commemorate the Endeavour's coming. This one doubles as a street lamp.
They'd left the Athenians of the Pacific far behind, and now they were about to meet the Spartans. The people of New Zealand were very different indeed to the Tahitians. The Maori were warriors, they were fiercely territorial, and some of them were cannibals. I suppose, Banks remarked later, that they live entirely upon fish, dogs, and enemies.
They launched a boat and went looking for water. No sooner had it reached shore than a war party of Maoris rushed it with jade war clubs and spears. The Marines opened fire, and a Maori chief fell dead.
He was a middle-sized man, tattooed in the face, in spiral lines very regularly formed. He was covered with a fine cloth of a manufacture totally new to us.
And that's all we know about the first Maori killed by an Englishman in the South Pacific. But the next day there were others. The Maoris attacked, the English fired back, and the usual tricks of using birdshot or firing over their heads didn't work at all. They completely failed to scare them. By the end of the day, 5 more Maoris were dead and several were wounded. Cook was heartsick at this, and Banks called it the most disagreeable day in my life. Black be the memory of it. In between the skirmishes, he and Solander managed to collect about 40 new kinds of plants, but they couldn't take on water, and there wasn't any food to be got, and so Cook named this wonderful landscape Poverty Bay. He sailed north, and now a new strand had been added to white experience in the Pacific, and from here, the long and melancholy story of English and American violence against indigenous peoples begins. A story which would have horrified Banks and Cook if they had lived to know about it.
For the next 5 months, Cook sailed around both the North and the South Islands of New Zealand. By March 1770, he had proved that this was not part of the southern continent, and that the very idea of such a continent, lying between the equator and latitude 40 degrees south, was a myth. Meanwhile, he, Banks, and everyone else on the ship had been seeing remarkable things. The culture of the Maoris, with their rigid mask-like tattoos, their huge canoes made from dugout logs felled with stone axes, their weapons, their sculpture, their plants. This is a honeysuckle, one of the more complex images among the 183 plates from New Zealand that comprise the second largest section of the Florilegium. When a proof has been run in the East London studio, the printers cross town to compare its colours with the original watercolour, which may not leave the museum.
Now we've had the plate rechrome, Chris. These lines won't stand here, won't print at all. And also the surface is much better.
Any changes are discussed in the botany department with all the source materials, including the original specimen.
The thing that worried me most about that was the pods, in fact. If you look at the original specimen, they're much darker.
Yeah, we could do with a bit more shadow, actually, on the side, which would give it a little bit more weight, really.
Yeah. Try any other colours.
In this laborious project, automation does not apply. By the end of March, the season was changing. It was the end of the Pacific summer, too late to go back east and face the storms of a Cape Horn winter. Cook decided to press on, sailing westwards. On April 19, they saw a coast where no coast was known to be. Cook turned north and began to follow it. It was the east coast of Australia, and they were the first Europeans to see it. On the 28th of April, James Cook saw Wide Bay. There were people fishing in canoes. As the Endeavour sailed by, they didn't seem to notice. So huge and complicated an artifact had no place in their culture. It was unnameable, and hence invisible. 2 warriors rushed forward on a spit of land, shaking their weapons. They uttered cries that sounded like "Warra Warra." These words, the first ever spoken by an Australian Aborigine to an English white, meant "go away." But the intruders did not go away. Today, the place of this momentous landing is a national park, and on holidays its air is blue with smoke from different campfires. To the Endeavour's crew, it looked nothing like this.
You'd have to remove quite a few of these surroundings before you got back to what they found here. A lean, scrubby headland, a bay full of sharks and stingrays, but a naturalist paradise. Now Banks and Solander were really in their element. Tahiti and New Zealand had been seen by other Europeans before, but this place, in a scientific sense, was entirely theirs, and now the Pacific flowered for them. It was like landing on an unknown planet whose contents had never been seen by the eye of science before, let alone classified or drawn or described. Today, such experiences lie mostly beyond the solar system or below the level of the atom. But in May 1770, these men had them here, literally at their feet. They didn't meet many animals. They saw some kangaroo dung, but not the creature itself. That little surprise would wait until later. They also saw the tracks of a dingo, and they made a pie out of cockatoos, which was tough, but probably better than ship's biscuit. The plants, however, almost wore them out.
They found so many species in the 8 days they were here that nearly half the plants in the Florilegium would be from the east coast of Australia. Long after they got back to England, their duplicates would be sent to more than a dozen museums across the world, from Edinburgh to New York, from Stockholm to Calcutta. Many of them came back to Australia, and they're preserved here in the National Herbarium of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney.
In later years, Banks's friends in London were in favour of calling the whole of New Holland after its botanical patron, and so we Australians narrowly missed out being known to the world as Banksians. Modesty, thank heavens, then prevailed, and instead the virtuoso's name descended upon a number of plants, including a whole genus of its own, Banksia. This is one of the original Banksias collected by Banks on the shores of Botany Bay 200 years ago. Banksia integrifolia.
This is another one, Banksia serrata. It looked and was like nothing that grows in Europe. Spiky, hairy, with strange reproductory habits. Even those hard seed pods with the gaping mouths that in years to come would frighten Australian children with stories of the bad Banksia man were an adaptation to Australian conditions. They protected the seeds against bushfires and sometimes could only be opened by their heat. Before it goes in the Florilegium, its pedigree and provenance are checked by the Natural History Museum.
This is the sketch, and the Banksia name is Leucodendron ceratifolia.
Well, that was the name that was used by Solander in his catalogue here.
The botany librarian, Judith Diamond, and the botanist Chris Humphreys, who were the editors of the edition, examine every stage of its journey from the original specimen collected by Banks and Solander through diary entries made on the Endeavour, the original watercolour painting, and finally the colour print.
This is Parkinson's sketch. His notes are on the back.
This journey has taken more than 2 centuries, and only when all the detail is right can the final print be approved.
Yes.
Eventually, the plants named the place. Cook had called it Stingray Harbour. But a few months later, sailing north, he tried other names to commemorate the work of his scientist passengers. Botanist Harbour, Botanist Bay, and then he inked in the name which was to become a symbol of dread for the English working class, the name of exile and punishment. Botany Bay was the furthest point of their voyage, but not the most dangerous one. Cook turned north again, and the Endeavour slowly made her way up the coast to the tropics. She was running into a trap, the coral maze of the Great Barrier Reef, unknown, uncharted, a labyrinth that stretched for 1,000 miles. On the 10th of June, she struck on the coral. Cook ordered all hands, including Banks, to the pumps. After 12 anxious days, they managed to bring the ship to beach at the mouth of what is now the Endeavour River. Here they hauled her down and began repairs. Hauling down meant beaching the ship and pulling her over on her side to expose the damage. The work took more than 6 weeks, the longest time that Banks and Solander had spent anywhere in Australia. Now, strange animals were seen.
He was not only like a greyhound in size and running, but had a long tail. What to liken him to, I could not tell. Nothing, certainly that I have seen, resembles him.
Before long, they shot one and skinned it. Enter the first kangaroo, later to be portrayed and shown at the Royal Academy by George Stubbs. Likewise, the first dingo, which Banks mistook for a wolf. It was, in fact, a native dog. Above all, Banks was busy botanizing. The germ of an idea was growing.
Upon the whole, New Holland, though in every respect the most barren country I've seen, is not so bad that, between the productions of the sea and land, a company of people who should have the misfortune of being shipwrecked upon it might support themselves.
This was the first hint of an idea of colonizing the place, although in the end it would be done by convicts, not castaways. The ship was repaired, and once more she sailed north. As they winched her off the beach and prepared to try the maze of reefs again, everyone must have shared Banks's anxiety.
The prospect was indeed melancholy. The sea everywhere full of innumerable shoals, some above and some underwater, and no prospect of any straight passage out.
But Cook's calm judgment saw them through. By mid-August, they had escaped the coral. They passed New Guinea and sailed on to Batavia, the furthest outpost of Dutch colonial rule in what is now Indonesia. Their first contact with European culture in nearly 2 years. Cook had protected them from the ocean and the unknown coast, but they did not survive contact with the Far East. Batavia, called Jakarta today, was a filthy place of bad water and stagnant air. Men sickened there and died. The first to go was the Endeavour's surgeon. He was followed by poor Tupaya, the Tahitian, who would never see England. Solander caught the fever but recovered. In all, the Endeavour lost 7 men there, and more would die later. In Batavia, Banks did the last of his botanizing, collecting and sorting the plants of Java. But Parkinson could not draw them. He was dying, and they buried him at sea. Banks himself was very weak with dysentery, but he survived. Batavia would provide 30 plates as the final contribution to the Florilegium. This infinitely troublesome business was the only way in the late 18th century that full-colour direct printing could be done from a single engraved plate with one pass. Joe Studham.
I mean, if you do 8 or 10 prints a day, you're doing extremely well. And at the end of the day, the prints that have been pulled in that day have to be dried under blotting paper and weights. And then it goes to the girl who looks after quality control, and she checks it against the master print. And if it survives that test, then it either gets collated, or more often it goes down to the watercolorists, because very often you can't get the overall tone which you get in a watercolor.
Is that a technique that Banks would have used?
Oh, certainly. It's an 18th century technique, yes. What they're doing all the time is removing all idea of their own hand, so that when you look at the completed engraving, you don't say, that was printed and that was hand-colored.
They sailed on. They rested at the Cape of Good Hope. On the last day of April 1771, the Endeavour crossed the meridian of Greenwich and completed her circuit of the globe. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 12th of July, 1771, they landed at Deal on the coast of Kent. They'd been away for 1,051 days, and 38 of their comrades had died on the voyage. James Cook went home to his wife. She was the only person who made a fuss over him, which suited them both. Banks stepped off the ship into a glow of adulation. His grand tour was over, and when the specimens and souvenirs were unpacked, the visitors to his London house, and there were many of them, realized what curiosities he had acquired. Portraitists competed to paint him, and he mixed with scientists, dilettanti, scholars, and well-born rakes. Satirical poems were written about his sex life in Tahiti.
More important, he had work to do, and much of it lay here in the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, where he became director. The gardens were organized around one imperial idea. They were to be the great living encyclopedia of the world's botany. Here, plants from all corners of the growing empire were brought back and studied, and wherever the Royal Navy went, it came back with seeds for Banks.
His fame as the virtuoso of the Pacific went on and on. When Captain Cook returned from his next voyage with a live noble savage, a Tahitian named Omai, it was natural that he should be associated with Banks and presented to King George III at Kew. His words to the monarch were, "How do, King Tosh?" The court was charmed, and Sir Joshua Reynolds painted him.
And then, of course, there was the Florilegium. Banks had put together a team of 18 engravers to turn Parkinson's drawings into copper plates. It took them 13 years, but by 1784, that stage of the great project was finished at a cost to Banks of rather more than £7,000. Now, it's hard to turn George III's money into modern values, but it helps if you remember that at the time, the wage of an agricultural labourer in England was about £5 a year.
While this was going on, Banks's house in Soho Square became a centre of learning for naturalists. No one considered his botanical education complete unless he had been there. In this atmosphere of benevolent scholarship, Banks lived with his wife Dorothea, whom he married in 1779. His sister, Sarah Sophia, spent her life helping the great man in his constantly busy round of scientific and social affairs.
So why wasn't the Florilegium published? Well, the strange thing is that nobody really seems to know for sure. It could be that Banks was already so famous by then that his thirst for glory had been slaked. At 35, he had already become president of the Royal Society, the most prestigious post in English science, effectively becoming one of the successors to the immortal Isaac Newton. Moreover, most of his companions in science already knew of the work that he and Solander had done in the South Seas. And there was a third factor, or might be, which was that in the 1780s there was a drop in wool prices, which took some of his rural income down. But in any case, he certainly didn't decide not to publish the Florilegium. He just let things slide, and the momentum was lost. A puzzle for us, and a minor tragedy for science.
Banks remained the president of the Royal Society for 4 decades. He spent his later years on an estate called Spring Grove near Isleworth, west of London. He left no heirs, except perhaps some unacknowledged ones in Tahiti. After his death in 1820, he was buried, as he had ordered, in an unmarked grave, below the floor of his local church at Heston, now a shabby suburb of London where the planes roar in on their flight path to Heathrow Airport.
Banks's real monument is here. It's not stone, it's paper, which outlasts stone. And I suppose that relatively few people are ever going to see it whole, because the Florilegium is not a bound book, but a set of boxes, 34 of them in all, the kind of boxes still technically known to museum curators as Solanders, after Dr. Daniel, who invented them. This is just half the stack. It's not the kind of thing that one thumbs through in idle moments before the fireside, and I suppose you could say that its virginity is guaranteed by its weight. But certainly nothing like it will ever be done again. Not in our age of photography.